good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a new session of the WSD Talks. The WSD Talks are an initiative of the Western Sephardic Diaspora Roadmap Project, developed by the CHAM, Center for the Humanities, and the Digital Humanities Lab, both of the Faculdade de Ciências Sociais e Humanas da Universidade Nova de Lisboa, with the partnership of the Cátedra de Estudos Sefarditas Alberto Benveniste of the Universidade de Lisboa, and funded by the Rothschild Foundation and DIV Europe. The WSD Talks are periodical meetings that give place to presentation of innovative projects and initiatives that combine the digital humanities with the preservation of archival heritage, in particular that related to the Western Sephardic diaspora. Thus, our guest today is Alessio Assonitis, the director of the Medici Archive Project. Will introduce us to the history of the Medici archival collections. Alessio Assonitis started to collaborate with the Medici Archive Project in 2004 and became its director in 2009, serving as principal investigator for digital projects supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. He has published extensively on topics related to Italian Renaissance art, book history, Medici history, archival studies, and digital humanities. He is the editor-in-chief of the journal Memoriae Dominicanae and founder and editor-in-chief of the Medici Archive Project, academic book series published by Harvey Miller Ripples since 2016. So now, Alessio, I give you the place.
Thank you very much, Carla, and let me share my PowerPoint. Here it is. Condividi. Okay. So my talk today is basically about the history of the Medici Archive from the very beginning in the late Middle Ages, all the way to the to today and to the future. So I mean, it's a very, very long history, and it's a history which is continuing and it's in the making. So here we have, you know, on the left we have the Medici, the archive of the Medici, which used to be at Uffizi. This is the top floor of the Uffizi, and as it was, you know, for many, many years. Before then, it changed many locations, but before it arrived to its current location, which is in the Arquivo di Stato in Florence, it used to be pretty much in between Palazzo Medici, Palazzo Vecchio, and Palazzo Pitti, and then eventually to the Uffizi. And then on the right, you have, you know, the modern incarnation of this archive, which is, of course, is the digital platform called MIA, which I will talk about later on. In order to talk about and this will be basically, my talk will be, you know, obviously a bit about the archival sort of history in the Renaissance and the early modern period, but for the most part, it's going to be about the past 20 years. That is about its many digital incarnations and how we got from one point to the other, you know, throughout the course of this past 20 years. So it's more about, and I am not a digital humanist by any means. You know, I'm an art historian, but I will show you the different strategies and the different ways we were able to get from one point to the other until today, that we have a rather successful digital platform that houses all of these documents, or at least most of these documents. Now, the core collection that has been, you know, at the center of the Medici Archive Project's work is the collection called Medici del Principato, which is located at the Arquivo di Stato in Florence, in the archive in Florence. It's a state archive, and the collection is, of course, a public collection. And what we're dealing with right now is this collection is not the Medici, you know, as the famous ones in the 15th century. So not Cosimo the Elder or Lorenzo the Magnificent, but it's mostly, in fact, all of it is about the Medici Grand Dukes. So the very first Grand Duke was Alessandro, the very first Duke was Alessandro, then Cosimo I, the founder of the dynasty, so to speak, and then eventually his children and grandchildren all the way to Giangastone, which was the last Medici Grand Duke who died in 1737. And with that, the Medici ended, the dynasty ended. So the archive that that we deal with is, I'm going to give you numbers because numbers are very important. I mean, we're dealing with within the realm of the humanities. This is probably what we would call generally big data. Obviously, within the realm of science, it is not by any means. So the archive is comprises about 6,500 volumes. You can see the volumes here stacked up in the old Uffizi location. It deals with 4 to 5 million letters, and just letters. So this is very important because later on we'll have, I'll explain why it's important, because we only deal with letters because this is just the diplomatic, the family, and the administrative archive of the Grand Dukes. Basically, when the Medici, a family, became a state, so it's merging two things, the state and the family. And it comprises, as I said, it runs basically from 1537, which is when Cosimo I became Duke, more or less. No, precisely 1537, but the archive starts around 1537. There's even some earlier stuff, but that's another issue. And it ends not with the death of Giangastone, the last Medici Grand Duke, but with the death of her sister, her name is Anna Maria Luisa, who is really the last Medici of this time. After that, there are no more Medici from the main branch. There are minor branches, but very, very minor, and not by any means with power or with the line of succession of becoming dukes. So it is about, as I said, it's an archive that deals with administration, with foreign diplomacy. In fact, the most part, almost 80% of the archive is about foreign diplomacy, and then of course of family matters, private matters. It is, as I said, made up of letters, and you can see a letter, an example of one of the 5, 6, 7 million letters. We don't know yet how many. There's so many. You see on the right, and this is an example of these letters. And as I said, pretty much everything is bound in volumes, and you see a volume right here with letters, mostly arriving letters, from all the world in what are called in Italian filze, or volumes. And you see an example right here of a filza, right? So we're dealing with a very large, very vast corpus of epistolary material, right? I'm just going to give you a brief sort of run through of what this archive is about and what can you find in this archive. As you can see, for the most part, you will find, diplomacy, commerce. A lot of letters deal with riots, with epidemics, with plague, but then there's a lot about, material culture, a lot of medicine. These are all the things that are tackled, that are discussed, that are written about in this large collection of letters. So it's really not just a kaleidoscopic archive that deals with so many different things, right, and so many different topics. But as I said, it's a global archive, for the reason that, a lot of these letters come from the ambassadors and the agents and the informers from all over the world. All the Medici agents, they really went from Madrid to Krakow to Istanbul to Stockholm. So they're all writing to Florence. So it's really much more a global archive than it is a Florentine or a Tuscan archive. So as you can see, these are all the subjects that are discussed quite frequently. And, it really goes from, as I said, natural catastrophes to migrations, to the New World, the information, to Jews, and I'll get that towards the end, to anything dealing with, with anything dealing with the early modern period. There's a famous quote by James Joyce. James Joyce said, the author said, if Dublin were ever to be destroyed, by a nuclear bomb, you can reconstruct Dublin just by reading Ulysses. It is obviously an arrogant sort of affirmation, but I can say that, you can probably reconstruct the early modern period just by looking at this collection, because it's global, because it really is about the entire world and not so much about Florence. In fact, there's a lot more information about the construction of Baroque Rome, for instance, than there is about the construction of Florence or the Duomo of Florence. So this is very important, because this gives the it gives you an idea of what we're dealing with in terms of content. Now, how did it all start? The very first database. I mean, the mission of the Medici Archive Project is to valorize and to publish this material. And everything started really in the mid-90s. So we've been around even before the term digital humanities was around, right? So what did we do? How do we make this archive available to people? Well, the very first step was to create a sort of bespoke access database, which you see right here. It was really done for this. So we had an access database, an access sort of entry database, which that worked. It basically was an in-house database. It was not online by any means, and and it was only mostly data entry. So what did we do? We had postdoctoral fellows coming from all over the world, and they would come to the archive, and you can see a picture of the archive right there on the upper right, and they would start transcribing the material in the letters, letter by letter, transcribing and entering this data in this system. And the system was very straightforward. If you think about it, a letter, all you need to know about a letter is, who sent it to whom, from where to where, the date, the content, that is basically the transcription. And then we also had a small synopsis, a small summary of the letter in English. Of course, the transcription is in the original language, which for 95% of it is Italian. And then you have a transcription in English, a very simple, a summary in English, not a translation, but a summary in English that allowed scholars to look quickly, and analyze very quickly what the letter was about in order then to get to the transcription, which was in the original Italian. So this database was, of course, not online. So what happened was that we had scholars coming from all over the world transcribing. And by the way, scholars, postdoctoral fellows, as I'm sure you know, are very expensive. They require sort of, salaries which go, which at the time were sort of exorbitant. So we had an average of, 7 to 8 fellows coming, and transcribing. So this is the first step. This started around 1999, and it continued until 2006, where people came to Florence to do this work. And also another thing that we did was anything that was entered in this database, any document, any letter that was transcribed, then a second fellow would check it. So there would be a vetting process, which make the whole process very slow. This is not an exact science. So therefore, people make mistakes, people get tired, people don't feel like working, sometimes, and therefore they make mistakes. So there's someone else checking. So as you can see, this is a very, very complicated process, but that's all we had at the time, and this is the beginning of sort of the web. And all this, another thing which is very important is that, we didn't have digitized material. So you had to rely on the transcription of the scholar who entered it. And this was basically how it was. And on top of every transcription, we also tagged historical figures. Every time someone was mentioned, we would have a profile of that person. So there's a biographical section, there's a geographical section every time a place was mentioned, and of course a topographical section every time a site within a city was mentioned. So it was basically, we tried to create a corpus of metadata, which was organic in many ways, but was specifically geared to a letter, to the epistolary form. Another thing that we did, because this database was created by, or the concept came from an art historian, right? So there was a special attention to categories of material cultures of any kind. Therefore, anytime we would be reading a letter and transcribing it, and we encounter any of the subjects that you see here on the right, anytime there's something mentioned dealing with academies or exotic animals to costumes or furniture, we would also tag that. That is, we would create categories of material culture, or in general categories of humanistic disciplines, or again, material culture. So this is how it started. This is the very beginning. So as you can see, it's a very long process. You read them. Of course, the writing sometimes can be as easy as this one right here. It's very easy, or it can be a little more complicated as this one right here, which is a little more hard to read, right? So of course, people not only the scholars who came had to have, of course, they were all scholars of early modern history or early modern disciplines, but they also needed to have, a good knowledge of paleography and archival science. So that was the profile that we were looking at the time for scholars. And this continued for six, 7 years, and we entered stuff. But the problem was that if people wanted to retrieve this information, they had to come to the archive. So it sort of defeats the purpose of digital humanities or the publication of stuff. Remember, at the time, we couldn't have put this stuff online. We had to wait a bit. So people came in this room and said, "Can you give me everything you have on Charles V and dogs?" And we would, someone would type it in, and like a call center, type it in, and they would, get all the information, then print them out and give them to the scholar, and that was that. So as you can see, this was an untenable situation, also because of the cost of postdoctoral fellows. So we decided the first step, the second incarnation of this platform was to put it online. And we had a very straightforward, a website, and it was all you could do is retrieve information. So it was a passive website, and you could find the same kind of information that you would find by coming to the archive. So it was very straightforward. You could do, complex searches. You can search on, on object, category, person. You can look at documents. But again, you were always relying on one thing. You were relying on the transcription of a fellow, the transcription of someone else. That is, if you were to publish any of this material, a lot of people, went to the archive, paged the volume and double check if everything was correct. And for the most part, it was correct. But still, before publishing something, you want to make sure that, the person that entered the material did a good job. So this lasted for basically for 12, for 6 years, this platform, this database that you see right here. Again, this was a problem because, as I said, you were relying on someone else's work. So what I did was, I went to Mellon, the Mellon Foundation, and I said, well, can we think about a situation? Can we think about a platform that also has, the digitized image of the document, And this was very important because this is what transformed, in a sense, our research institute. Because so I went to the Mellon Foundation, and I came up with a project called BIA, and BIA, which is a platform, it's still around, it's still available right now, And what it did was basically, it had the image of the document. So it had all the things it had before. So it had the transcription, the synopsis, and all the various tags, people, things, and everything else, profile, but it also had the original right here. This platform also solved another problem, because I believe that digital humanities are there to solve problems, not to create problems and then solve them. Because for the most part, I see that a lot of digital projects create the problem and then solve it, but it was never there to begin with. The problem here was, as I mentioned before, that postdoctoral fellows were very expensive. We couldn't afford. It was basically having, in the average of 35, 40,000 euro per fellow times 10 each year. And as you can imagine, it was an exorbitant amount of money. And the foundations, like the Mellon, like the Cress, like the National Endowment for Humanities, were less likely to sponsor this. It was also the time of the crisis of 2008. So in 2008, there was a world crisis. So, it was complicated and we couldn't afford doing it. So what did I do? I thought, well, rather than having scholars come to Florence, let's bring the documents to the world. And that's what we did. And so I made an agreement with the Italian government, with the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, and they allowed us to take pictures of these documents and publish them online, for the use of the entire community, because everything that we do is for free. You don't have to pay for anything. You just have to sign up. So we created this, and so from inside fellows, we had something called off-site fellows, so distant fellows. And distant fellows would be entering material, they had the image because we took the pictures and uploaded them on the system, and they would begin transcribing and doing the work that they usually did in Florence, they would do from their homes anywhere in the world. right? So this is what happened. And of course, you had the same things you could do before. You can do complex searches. Here's a search of, Cosimo I, gifts to the Medici, and the year 1550. So all the documents that have these three categories or these three search filters, and then you had the document and you would have the transcription, and at the same time, you would have the image of the document. So you can double check. You don't have to come to Florence to double check. You had it right there in terms of an image. This worked very well. And here it is, the sort of the transcription module that allowed people to work from home. So you would have the image of the document and you would be transcribing in this little window and entering all the metadata. So it is something that was, it worked. It still works in many ways, It was something that, it, again, solved the problem of, really a financial problem, a money problem, having people come. And also it enlarged our community, because it had basically, rather than having 10 people, it would have 50, 60 people working on this project, on this transcription project, on this digitization project. So we basically created a community sourcing concept that was, and this is back in 2012. Now, these are the different topics, you can still do today, using this platform, whether it's an article or a dissertation, but just by using this collection. Bear in mind, though, that this collection is only one of many collections in the Arquivo di Stato in Florence. It's one of 600 collections. And the Arquivo di Stato in Florence is one of 120 state archives in a constellation of archives that comprises something like 8,000 communal archives and about 15,000 between ecclesiastical, private, and university or hospital archives, or confraternity archives. So it's a vast, vast world of archival data. So, but this is just one. But it's a pretty complete one. This is, I think, of this archive, of this collection, as a kind of very intelligent index, from where to look at things and then dig in and then eventually explore in different collections. Because it is, after all, the archive of a European dynasty. So, it doesn't have a sense of completeness. As much as I like to think of that James Joyce statement I said before, you're still required to dig in and deepen your understanding with notarial archives that are not here, with financial archives, with birth, baptism records, and so many different records that you have available in Florence or in Italy, or in that case in Europe, for that matter. So these are the different topics that scholars began tackling, began approaching, and some of them have been done. Some of them are, have yet to be done, and you have to be executed. So another thing, so the problem was at a certain point that, remember, there's a solution and there's a problem and there's another solution. The problem was that not everybody in this entire sort of universe of scholars was able to read 16th century and 17th century Italian script. So what did we do? I went back to the Mellon Foundation and said, okay, Mellon, we have an issue here. Yes, we have, the system works. People are transcribing, people are entering. However, it is very limited because they can read this stuff. So we also have at MAP, at our research institute, seminars on paleography and archival science here in Florence. But we have it 3 times a year, and it didn't really solve the problem. What solved the problem was creating another a module like this one, which is a teaching module, which is attached to the BIA platform, which allows us to teach how to read documents. How to read paleography. Basically, it teaches paleography in a very sort of, in a very hands-on approach. And this is also interesting because we would be teaching paleography, teaching how to read these documents on the very documents that we would be entering in the system. So while we were teaching, students were also entering at the same time. And the BIA teaching module was simply a asynchronic module. It wasn't an online teaching. It wasn't live like today, but basically, scholars would, do sort of crowd transcriptions. We would sort of, there was an instructor and we would begin to transcribe and the students would ask questions and, annotate, because there's also annotation module. And you can see here, they would annotate a word, and say, what does it mean? How do you do this? It was a very, very, it was a very, you know, for 3 or 4 years, it worked very well. The only problem here is that, you know, the instructor teaching this, because it's asynchronic, which means that anyone from around the world, from Australia to Japan to America, would ask questions all the time. You know, there was never, the day never ended. So it was always very hard to keep up with all the questions that came up, but it worked. That is, we had students, you know, who learned how to read documents online, and at the same time, they would be entering documents. So the Mellon understood this. The Mellon Foundation said, okay, good, you know, create a module that makes sense, that allows you to teach how to read documents. And here we have the annotation module. But then we went further, because you see, you know, the more you create, I mean, I always think of digital humanities, of digital projects as ongoing projects. They don't stop. You know, once the project is done, it continues. You build on what you've done before. So I went back to Mellon and said, you know, Mellon, you know, and they're very receptive. You know, I think, you know, we solved one problem, but there are many, many other problems coming up, and I'll tell you what the problems are, and I tell you how we resolved them. Well, for the first problem was that we were only dealing with one collection of the Medici Archive, which is the letter collection, which is called Medici del Principato, the one I just mentioned just now, the one I just described. But the Medici had also other collections which are organically linked to the letters. For instance, the collection of, and I'll show you right now, and here are the different, the 5 other collections, the collection of the Medici before, you know, the 16th and 17th century, namely the Medici of Lorenzo the Magnificent and Cosimo the Elder. They had another collection. So when I went to Mellon, I said, you know, we would like to unite these 2 collections, you know, because one is the Grand Dukes, you know, Cosimo I, Francesco, Ferdinando, the great Grand Dukes, but then there's also the collection of the merchant bankers, you know, and this collection, which is called Medici avanti il Principato, so the Medici before the Grand Duchy, is a very peculiar collection because it's a mix of many different things. It's a very heterogeneous sort of collection. It's a very, you know, it's not organic, it's not complete. While the first one, Medici del Principato, is somewhat complete, you know, whatever that means, obviously. This is much less complete. It's a hodgepodge of different kinds of typologies of documents. Letters, of course, but also financial documents, legal documents, what else? Contracts and wills and account books. So you had so many different kinds of things. And here are examples. Here we have an inventory of books, and here we have an account book, with sort of the entry, with the accounting, with the sort of the financial entry of the Bank of the Medici. So we wanted to unite these 2 things. That is, unite the merchant banking family to the Grand Dukes, because there's a continuation, historical continuation. It's not that when the Medici become Grand Dukes, you know, their past gets erased, as if they're 2 separate things. They actually are connected. Archaically speaking, they're not connected because their organization is very different, right? But in terms of the history, it's also, this collection is very small. It's only 150,000 folios instead of 7 million letters. So it's very different to an extent that this collection right here has already been put online only with the image, no metadata, by the Archivio di Stato back in the late 90s. So it already existed, but there was no metadata. So all you had was basically the PDF of these letters, and you have to be able to read this stuff. And 15th century Italian script, which is the mercantesca, the mercantile script, is a lot harder than the 16th and 17th century chancellor style, the cancelleresca, which is a lot easier to read. So the idea was to unite, you know, all these different collections. So this is one of them. Another one was the archival collection of the Medici inventories of mobile objects. So the inventories of objects. So we had a lot of inventories of various different kinds. And again, vast number of volumes of list of objects of collecting that the Medici had, and also financial receipts and everything else, dealing with the mobile objects, dealing with works of art, with furniture, with any kind of thing that you use a whip. So it's basically a collection of material culture of an inventory of material culture. And here is an example. This example is the inventory of Duke Francesco, Francesco I, from 1575, and there are basically 150 folios of just lists and lists of objects that were in the Medici palaces and villas. And this is obviously great for, art historians, of course, but also people working on material culture. It's very important because you have here, Basetto right here, you have, cassettina, medaglie, and so on and so forth. But you also have paintings and sculptures and drawings. So you have the entire universe of what becomes, the great collection in the Uffizi and Palazzo Pitti and throughout Tuscany. So this, I wanted to unite the letters and the letters of the Grand Dukes with the previous archive, the letters of the Grand Dukes in the previous archive with their inventories. But also I did something else. I took the step forward. That is, I also wanted to unite another collection. It was the collection of the real estate material of the Medici. And this collection is basically, blueprints and payment records and all different kinds of things dealing with the real estate, dealing with, with things which are immobile, so to speak. Villas, palaces, and even the Jewish ghetto. The Jewish ghetto belonged to the Medici. So even that information was in this collection. So again, I was trying to unite these two things because they made sense. Then I also tried to resolve another problem. And this problem is this one right here, because again, archives, the history of archives is never linear. It's always complicated. Archives, I've been working with archives for 30 years. There's always complications. There's never really an archive which is intact. And by the way, the one I mentioned before, the first one, the letters, it's pretty intact, but it's not completely intact. And the history of archives is made up of complications. What happened? In the mid-late 18th century, when the Medici were gone, when they were no longer a family, they were extinct, and the Habsburg-Lorraine ruled Florence, ruled Tuscany, one of the dukes, the Habsburg dukes of Tuscany, asked this man right here, you see right here, Riguccio Galluzzi, to write a history of the Grand Duchy, of the Medici Grand Duchy. He was a historian, and he was also in charge of the archive, the collections that I just mentioned. He was the person in charge of this collection. And at the time, this collection was utter chaos. It was utter disaster. So what this man did, right? As I said, first of all, he separated, the merchants from the dukes, as I mentioned before. But what he also did is, while writing his book, which is a 7-volume book, is a very huge book on the Medici Grand Duchy, rather than consulting the archive as we would be doing, going to the archive, what he did as an archivist is he started removing, folios from the volumes, 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, almost 2 million pieces of stuff that was originally in the volumes. He removed them with the idea that someday he would put them back in, but he never did, of course. Like in Italy, we create the problem, we never solve it. So he removed all these things. So what he did, effectively, is create another collection. So let's go back to the list. So the first platform dealt with this one, Medici Principato. Then, we said, okay, let's add the one, of the Medici, the bankers, this one. Let's add the one of the inventories, and let's add the one about the real estate. And then on top of it, this new one was created, which is the stuff that this guy removed, right? So one of my ideas was to reunite, the concept of the new platform called MIA, which is the one which exists today, was basically reuniting, number one, the stuff that was removed with the stuff that, in its original place. But of course, we wouldn't do it physically, because we usually, if you do that, you create more problems, but you can do it digitally. That is, sometimes you have a letter and sometimes you have an attachment. The letter stays in one place, the attachment went somewhere else, and you reunite them together, so that, if a letter is mentioned in the attachment, then you can actually see the attachment, which can be anything, a manuscript, a book, anything, a horoscope, a notarial document, so anything that was removed, by this man, now it's reattached together. So that was the first idea, when I went to Mellon. The second idea was the idea of continuity, as I mentioned. the bankers, and the dukes now are united together. Now they're part of the same collection. Again, you can do it digitally. Physically you cannot do it because they're very different in terms of their archival organization. And then I thought, I want to create a platform, right, that can create these sort of thematic archives, where people can actually take documents from the various collections to create a kind of thematic archive. And here is an example of, I worked on the library of Cosimo I. So here I have the inventory of his books, right? Here I have letters requesting books, buying books, whatever, dealing with books. And here I have the location from that real estate collection that I mentioned before of the library. So I have basically the inventory, the reason why the book was bought or received as a gift or whatever, and then its location. So that was part of the idea, reuniting these two things. So that's how we came up with the concept of MIA, which is what exists today. MIA is, again, this platform right here that I mentioned before at the very beginning. This is the MIA. This is obviously the simple, I'll show you, how it works. And these are all the more technical things you can see right here in terms of how it was coded. So again, the idea of reuniting, collating, and putting things together thematically, archivally, historically, chronologically was part of the reason why I went back to Mellon. So Mellon said, fine, wonderful. But then something else happened, which really changed the entire ball game. At the beginning, as I said, for the first platform, BIA with the B, we had photographers take pictures of the documents in the Archivio di Stato and then upload them. They would take pictures and upload them. These are the digitization technicians, right? But then in 2017, something extraordinary happened in this country. Very rarely it happens, which was that people can take photographs of documents. Previously, if you want to have an image of a document, you have to go through a photographic service company that would charge you $2 or €2 per image. So, as you can imagine, if this archive is made up of 6-7 million documents, and on top of that, another 10-15 from the other collections, this would be basically, the budget of a small European country, right? So it was very expensive. So, but when we were allowed, there was a liberalization of the image, when we would take, we were allowed to take images, and use them for scholarly use, not for financial use, right? People were going to the archive, as they do today, and take pictures of documents and documents and documents of volumes. Sometimes I have a fellow today who came to me and said, I took almost 600 images of a volume, and rather than going through them as you do in the old days and finding what you needed and then transcribing, and then we just take pictures and pictures and pictures of folio after folio after folio, go home and then analyze them. Chances are, because the volumes talk about so many different things, that they only find 1 or 2 or 3 images dealing with what they were doing. The rest were useless, in many ways. So I came up with the idea, of a platform that you can upload the image. So people would upload the image of the Medici archive onto the system, right? And and share the images, and sometimes more than just the image, the transcription and of these documents. And this is a key aspect in terms of, again, there was a problem, we found a solution to that problem. So we, even the people who would take pictures in the archive, our digitization technicians, they were, they're not expensive, but they cost some money. Here, everything came up for free. And we created the system where people can upload the images and put them in a system that had already an order, that are already an organized order. So there was, so if you took the images of volume 126 of the Medici Principato, you would look up the system, type 126, and the entire system would allow you the space to upload images. So you upload them, here are all the collections, you would upload images, and create your personal archive and then share with everybody else. So here is, we had, so one would basically, upload the images, just the images, and then this is the first step. In the second step, they would begin to qualify the image, or qualify the document by describing what it was in a very simple metadata. And then if they wish to, they would continue with more complicated or more complex metadata. That is, the complex metadata is, of course, the transcription of the document and all the metadata around it. So that was the idea. That is, it was a basic, it is today a large community source project, where people just upload stuff all the time and share them. Of course, if someone is working on a special project, on a thesis or dissertation, on an article, and does not want to share this material until it's ready to be published, then there's a way of keeping it secret, keeping it, not sharing it, with the entire community. So this is what it was. Of course, in this module, MIA, we kept the transcription module. People can transcribe from home, so if, Carla would upload a document, I would be able to transcribe it from, she's in, I guess, Lisbon. I would be in Rome and do it from Rome, or Australia and Japan. I mean, it was a system that works very well because it was a way of, as I said, of a distribution of labor, of a way to simplify and to make faster, a project or an operation that would take a long time. So this is what we did. Of course, you can do all different kinds of searches. You can search anything you want, complex, simple, so on and so forth. Remember, you don't have the letters now. You have everything. Inventories, real estate. You have so much data, so much information. And then, of course, you can also, enter the biographical profiles. There are almost 25,000, bios of people, already entered. So, for instance, if I were to enter a document and the word, Charles V would come up in the document, I don't have to enter Charles V. It's already in the system. So this allows for 25,000 people to be in the system already. So it's very easy. The process is very fast. But sometimes new people come up and you have to enter them from scratch. So, and by this, you can create, extremely complex profiles of historical figures, and attached to them, you have the documents where they're either senders, recipients, or they're being mentioned, right? So, and of course, that what I mentioned before. Remember I told you about that man who separated everything? Now you can bring them back together. So there's a collation module. There's a reorganization module, which allows you to put things together in a way that as it was originally. So that again is an archival operation that doesn't require any kind of physical intervention. And you can create case studies, so, I can collect all the documents of Plague 1630, or all the documents of the Jewish ghetto, or all the documents in Galilean telescope. You can create these sort of meta archives, trans-archival collections, that are allow you, to construct a thematic sort of approach, for your use or for the use, because you can also share these documents with either with the entire community or with groups of people. So it works very well because it allows you to come up with, documents from different sources, always Medici, of course, and begin to come up with thematic sort of organizations, which are completely personal and do not destroy, of course, or intervene within the physical realm, right? You can still do the annotations and you can still annotate, you can still ask questions, and bring them up to the entire community. How do you read this? Is it Napolitano or is it, Napolitana? Is it a difference? I mean, there's always that kind of, that kind of integration within the larger community that is necessary, because otherwise, it's a very cellular approach. Instead, we wanted to make it a much more community approach. And of course, you can, again, the idea of sharing, a corpus of 15 million documents, the creation of digital communities, the collaboration of transcriptions, because people can collaborate in transcribing together things that are complicated. So you put a document and people can work together on the transcription, or you can also teach, of course, as we had in the previous system. You can teach things and make this available to a larger community. There are a number of professors who use this to teach either history or archival studies or paleography. It's something that has been very successful, up to this point. Then we came up with something else. This is something that, unfortunately, I haven't pushed through it, but I'm still working on it. I mean, it exists, which is basically this. We had a scholar, right, at MAP, who years ago back in the mid 2011 or 12, discovered the marriage contract of the painter Artemisia Gentileschi. So she found the contract in the Medici collection, right? And and she thought, okay, as a scholar, she wanted to publish that document. So the first thing she did was to figure out whether that document had been published already. So after some time, she went through the literature and discovered that the document was never been published. So she wrote an article, contextualizing this document and sent it to a journal. The journal accepted the article and sent it back to her with changes, addenda, corrigenda, and eventually she made the corrections and wrote the article, and then was finally published, right? And it came out after a year and a half or 2 years from its discovery. Eventually, though, as we know very well, being published doesn't mean anything. You have to have the impact factor. That is, people have to cite you have to cite this article or your work in their own work. And therefore, from the time the document was discovered all the way to the point where it was actually cited in someone else's work, 3.5 years passed, and that's such a long, long time. So we came up with this idea of publishing, what are called in our field short notices. That is, a document of a certain kind of importance, right? Contextualizing it, transcribing it, providing it with a bibliography, going through a peer review. But the whole process, rather than taking, and also giving the document a protocol number that can be cited, rather than taking, 4 years, it took, for the publication and the impact factor, much, much less. So we came up with a publication module where things can be published. We're not talking about articles, we're talking about documents of a certain kind of importance. Of course, it has to go through a peer review. I have to fill out all the information and send it to our system, and I would then give it to scholars who could check it and see whether if this document is important, or not, and then it enters the system. So this was something that we came up with. Unfortunately, we started doing this, but we never actually pursued it for, because we are for various reasons. I think we tried a couple of things, we tried a couple of documents and we did it, but we never actually, this also needs a sort of a social media or whatever, a publication or a notification to the wider world, so that people know that this came out, and, and we never really worked on that. But the idea of publishing something, bear in mind that every document in our system has a protocol number. So if you want to use that document, you have to cite that protocol number. You have to cite, this is from the MIA, the Medici Archive Project MIA platform number 56204, right? So otherwise it's plagiarism, right? So, but this was a way to valorize, to emphasize the discovery, to bring it to the fore and make it a little more visible. So this is also part of the system. Of course, the MIA system is an open source system. So we have other projects, other archives which are using this, for their own sort of purpose. In this case, we have the Falconieri, which is a completely different collection, is a private collection of letters from the 17th century. They've used the system in order to, to create their own, digital platform, which is specifically dealing with one separate collection that is not Medici. And then, of course, we're also using this system for another project that we're doing on Avvisi. Avvisi are the early modern newspapers from the 16th, 17th century. We received a fellowship from the grant from the NEH, and we're working on publishing these basically newspapers from the 16th and 17th century that came from all over the world. So we're using the same open source system for this specific project. And of course, the next step, the final step of our digital world is the ghetto mapping project, which is specifically dealing with Jewish history. Now, the way the Medici Archive Project works is that we have, of course, our mission is, of course, to put things online, but we also have specific programs dealing with specific aspects of early modern disciplines. So we have a program on women artists, just dealing with women artists with a director, And she is in charge of the publications, of the conferences, of the interviews, of the documentaries. We have a program on the history of news. We have the program on history of medicine. We have a program on early modern Greece. Specific programs, again, that can valorize this incredible treasure trove of archival information. And of course, we have one on Jews, on Jewish culture. Why do we have a program on Jewish culture? Well, first of all, because statistically speaking, this is actually, we might think this is crazy, but 1 in every 20 documents, or every 20 documents in the Medici collection has to deals with Jews. So out of, if you would get 20 letters, 1 of them either deals with Jews, Jewish culture, statistically speaking. I mean, it was, that's why at the beginning I had that list of categories, and Jews appeared, as their own category, because they are, because of the history of Jewish culture, of Jewry in Florence and Tuscany, but also in the more global sense, because remember, it's a global archive. So information came from all over the world as well. So 1 out of 20 documents, or 25 documents, deals with Jews. So that's what we decided to create a program that would specifically address this issue, that would specifically deal with Jewish culture. And, so we had lots of documents about Jews in Florence, Jews at court, but we also had information. We knew that there was a ghetto in Florence. The ghetto was in the center of the city. It was, constructed by Cosimo I in 1569, 1570. It was enlarged by Cosimo III in 1709, 1710. It was when the Medici became extinct, Jews started leaving the ghetto and moved out, right? Eventually, it was sold, the ghetto was sold to Jews. The Jews owned it, but it was pretty much abandoned. And when Florence became the capital of Italy, because Florence was the capital of Italy for 5 years after the unification of 1861, they decided that because the ghetto was in the center of the city, it was really close to the Duomo, and it was abandoned, and it was in a horrible state. They decided to demolish the ghetto and create this big, sort of late 19th century piazza, which is called Piazza della Repubblica, right? So we wanted to know, we wanted to have information about the ghetto. So where do we find this information? Where do we find the construction, the data about how it was built, when, how? So, we thought, we looked at everywhere. We looked at synagogue records, we looked at, other Jewish records, and there was nothing about the construction. And then it came up to me, it was owned by the Medici, so it must be in their collection of real estate stuff. And lo and behold, we found 90 volumes of material on the construction of the Jewish ghetto in this collection, in the Medici collection of real estate property. So we found, basically, I'll show you, you see these things right here? These are basically the blueprints of every single apartment in the Jewish ghetto, since the construction in 1572, its amplification, enlargement in 1710. Every single apartment. Not only we found every single apartment, we couldn't find the master plan, but every single apartment. So what we did was basically take every single apartment and, like a puzzle, reconstruct the ghetto. We had an idea how it looked like from prints, but these prints are very generic. This is a map of the city, the famous Bonsignori map of the 1580s and 90s, and you have a very generic look of how, it wasn't a technical drawing by any means. So we found every single apartment, and with AutoCAD, which is a program for architects, we, like a puzzle, put it together, and we came up with, with this. Here is the construction of the ghetto. Here is the model that was printed, and here is how it would look like in Florence, had it existed. Here it is. So this is the Duomo of Florence. This is the baptistry, and here is the ghetto right here. And this came up with very meticulous, painstakingly hard, piecing together with an architect, and eventually with a program, and eventually with, a more digital rendition, which is this one, and of course, a printout. So this was what we did. But this project stemmed out of the earlier platform, because in the platform, we had documents dealing with the real estate material, and that stuff was there. we just didn't know. We couldn't find it. We had no idea it was there, but we were able to find it thanks to the cross-referencing of data. And this is how it exists. So again, we use we're using right now the same open source MIA platform for specifically Jewish documents, even though there's a whole section of Jewish documents in the MIA database, right? The last one I mentioned, but we want to do a specific one, a dedicated one just for Jews. And bear in mind that it's not just about Florentine Jews, it's about Jews everywhere in the early modern world. We found documents about Jews in the New World. In Peru, we had documents about Jews in the various diasporas, the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic, the Sephardic, Flanders, Florence triangle, but the Italian Jews, El Kim, in Rome, of course, the oldest congregation, the oldest community after the Holy Land, and the Jews in Venice. So it's a great hub for material on Jewish culture, people, whether they're individuals writing or people being mentioned or communities changing or migrations. It became a very vast source. And of course, it also became a source for Florence because it also had a Florentine thing. So it's about the local Jews and the Jews around. And like this, we were able to create the network. Because another thing that we were able to discover in this collection, remember, this is still the Medici collection, is the name of every single Jew who lived in the ghetto from the construction to the end. So every single name of every single person living there, And it's a mix, of course, of Italian, Florentine, Tuscan Jews, and a lot of them of Sephardic Jews that came in the 1580s and 90s, always usually via Flanders, but not necessarily. So it's a big sort of, in fact, if in the reconstruction of the ghetto, this that you see right here is the Italian synagogue, and this is the Sephardic synagogue. So they had two synagogues, two separate communities sort of living in this space. So we came up with all the names. So we're doing a project, dealing with genealogies, trying to reconstruct the genealogies of the Jewish community in Florence. Some names are very famous. The Abrabanel family is a very famous sort of, Spanish, moved to Naples, in the Kingdom of Naples, and then moved to Florence, and then moved to Ferrara, and then eventually went to New York much later. So we were able to reconstruct this whole network of Jewish families, and this led to the next project, because I'm going to show you how organically everything is. The digital project allowed us to move on to the next thing, which was an exhibition on this. So from a digital, now we're going back to a physical, because in 2023, we're doing an exhibition at Palazzo Pitti Uffizi, which is the same thing now, on the Jewish ghetto, and the Jewish community in Florence, which has, of course, archaeological stuff, photographs, ketubah, manuscripts, passports right here, paintings. We even found a Jewish 17th century painter, who painted like Caravaggio, still lives like Caravaggio. So this, as you can see, the digital and the research, the physical and the traditional ways of doing research come together very organically. And of course, on top of that, we do what institutions usually do, which is conferences. Here are all the conferences that we did, of various different kinds of things, from, something on the Venetian ghetto, to the Medici in the Levant, the Medici in the relation to Constantinople, to nuns, to Artemisia Gentileschi, to the bastard Medici, the ones that came out of wedlock, or to the enemies of the Medici. So all this, as this manifestation, it started digitally, because usually it's the opposite. Usually an institute starts traditionally, conferences, books, exhibitions, and then moves in the digital. We started from the digital and then sprouted. The digital allowed us to spawn off to make more traditional kind of things, like an exhibition, like conferences, like books. We have a book series that has, different kinds of aspects that we're dealing right now. They are published, the result of this research. And of course, as I mentioned, exhibition. We already did 2 exhibitions before. One was on the German guard of the Medici, like the Swiss guard of the Pope. The Medici had a German guard. So it was an exhibition about armor. And then we did an exhibition, still linked to the program of women artists, of a 17th century painter called Giovanni Garzoni, which opened at Palazzo Pitti just after the first pandemic. So again, I want to emphasize, that what we do as as an institute that started off, from a strictly speaking digital perspective, we tried as much as possible to put the humanist back in the digital, and even sometimes the human back in the digital, because I think that's very important, for any institutions to combine these two things, to make them very organic, and not have two things separately or two things working parallel to each other without ever converging. Basta.
Thank you, Alessio, for this fascinating presentation. I think that it was an inspiration for other projects. I was listening to you and thinking in ways of to use some of these methodologies even in Portuguese archives. I think that it's quite interesting. Now I will open the discussion. Se alguém tiver alguma questão, então pode levantar a mão, ou se não também pode colocar no bate-papo. If you have any question, you can raise the hand or write in the chat. I will begin with one question. I think that it's very interesting, this idea of collaborative work in the platform, namely in the transcription of documents. And I'd like to know how you control the quality and the uniformity of the criteria in the transcription, since it is made for so much people.
Yeah, this has been the issue and the problem always. Who is the authority? And the concept of authority, is a concept that, to me, at least personally, doesn't really work if you have a large corpus of material entering all the time. That is, then it becomes like USSR, you have more people checking than people being checked, which is sort of defeats the purpose. So we always thought that the best way of doing it was community sourcing and community, not crowd, community sort of, authority. That is, people, look at documents, because as a scholar, you always have to double check. As a scholar, you check these materials, you always verify before you're being published, whether the person who is entering both the transcription and the synopsis, if that person is actually doing the right thing. So it's part of the deal. I mean, I do it too with my own stuff, with my own things that I've entered. Something that I entered 20 years ago, I double check it. It's my own stuff, and I pretty much trust myself sometimes. So, I mean, it's important to so the authority comes by having a guideline of how to enter material. For instance, you might ask, how long is a synopsis? How long is a summary, right? Well, a summary can be very long or very short, But you see, with the system of having a transcription and the system of having an image of the document, you have checks and balances all the time, So you find the information, you look at it, you analyze it, and then you are the judge, you are the authority, the community is the authority, decides whether that is good or not, correct or incorrect. Should it be incorrect, then there's a system of, of annotations and of signaling the mistake or the imperfection to the general community, and the author usually is notified, and then the author goes back, the person entered, the sort of the creator, and then he enters a discussion about whether or not, Charles V is Charles V or Charles IV, that's how it works. Otherwise, if we think about someone sort of the big brother above, it's never going to work. It's an untenable situation, And mind you that, we still require, I mean, as much as people like to think or want to think that there's OCR who is able to read this stuff. Well, let me tell you that there isn't, because the scripts are so many. You have millions of different kinds of scripts. And also you have abbreviations, you have, abbreviations, an uncodified process, abbreviations. I mean, if you do with Latin paleography, I was trained as a classicist. So Latin paleography has very strict abbreviations, which are very codified. You pretty much know what they are, right? Give or take, they change, but they're pretty much the same. When you come to Italian, you know, the abbreviations, and when you come to the invention of cheap paper, you know, when people, you know, have lots of space and are not sort of running on a dead sheep, right, anymore, right, which is very expensive, the vellum or the parchment, then people abbreviate in their own kind of way all the time. It changes all the time. There's some convention, but so an OCR can never pick up all the different kinds of variations and all the kinds of variations of script, you know, the different different punctuations, the different spellings, because the Italian that is written in the 16th century, it's pretty much the Italian that we speak today, right? It's very similar. I mean, there's no like, you know, difference between, let's say, Chaucer and the English that's spoken today. The Italian of the 16th century is very close to the Italian that we speak today, with some changes, of course, with some differences, but it's pretty much close. However, has not been codified in a certain kind of way. So you have variations of spelling, Michelangelo, Michelagnolo, Michelangelo. I mean, you know, you have different, so that OCR doesn't allow you to do that. And we tested OCR, and there's something called Transcribus, which allows you to do this kind of stuff. But it has to be helped. It has to be fed. And I'm very much a believer in the human mind more than the actual machine. However, we are working with, you know, artificial intelligence and different kinds of things. But I still believe very much as I am director, I'll be director of MAP, that the human has to be placed in the digital, not vice versa. The human has to be in control of the digital. It has to be a tool. When this equation is inverted, so to speak, then you have a different kind of project, a different kind of, you know, different kind of approach, and a different kind of methodology, you know. And maybe it's happening elsewhere, but we don't do that. We believe in slow data, big data, but especially slow data, like slow food.
Kevin?
Thank you, Carla. Thank you very much for your talk. I had a lot of things to ask and to comment, but it was indeed very interesting. I'll focus only on two topics. I was impressed with this information of 4 million letters, around 4 million to 5 million letters. And this means, correct me if I'm wrong, that for the period of the existence of the archive, they wrote about 18,000 letters a year. And I think this, for me, I'll not enter here in questions of political culture or governance that are not so important right now. But for me, this invites us to think archives as a much more sort of complex structures than sometimes we believe they are. They are made of different people that certainly had different ways of organizing and displaying stuff. And I was wondering if you could tell us something about this, and also how to conjugate this complexity of the archive as a dynamic structure with, let's say, more simplistic representation online. So how to give online readers notions of how the archive it's such a dynamic place and sort of dynamic construction structure. And also you talked about some categories around art history. And I'm sure that sometime you must have thought, well, we should have added this category, or we should have made this or that. So right now we are with I know a project in Lisbon that is working with rituals, and besides the art history categories, they added the categories related to subaltern populations, so slaves, servants, because this is something that is right now it's quite important. But we know for sure that in future some other categories will show up. And also in the project with Carla, we have specific categories that we are applying, but they're all always sort of, we never know when enough is enough. So
right. Listen, the concept of categories is something that started before my time. So, and it was meant by an art historian, but at the same time, you know, we had suggestions. Like, you know, for instance, why don't you put a category for gender studies, right? You know, makes sense. But how would you define gender studies? You know, how, I mean, is every letter dealing with women, gender studies? You know, how would you pinpoint that, right? Or another of these liquid categories is diplomacy. I mean, everything is diplomacy. I give you a gift, that's diplomacy. I step, in the border of your country, that's diplomacy. So you have to be very careful in how to approach that kind of stuff. I mean, the idea of the categories came up because you had to link, you had to link an object. It works if you objectify things. If you don't object, at least at the time, remember, this is something that started from an art historian. I inherited this, and I'm an art historian too, by the way. So, I mean, in a sense, I understand that. But, how do you, for instance, legal studies, I mean, how would you define that? And you would enter a you would open a can of worms, in terms of defining a category when it's not objectified. And that's the issue there. That was a problem there. So you basically answer the question about the dynamic aspect. I mean, yes, more categories come up, more new categories, new disciplines are emerging, from a period which was very static 20 years ago, let's say, very, very static. So new categories are emerging, new disciplines are emerging. I can't go back and read everything again and enter new categories, for instance, one thing that I did, there was a category called dance and music, right? So, I thought to myself, well, let's split it up, dance and music, but I never see anyone dancing without music. So, I mean, in a sense, the two things go together, but bear in mind that these are just ways of approaching an issue. They're not sort of categorical in their organization. This is just one way of approaching a vast ocean of documentation. It's one way of entering it. Of course, that's why I go back to the concept of the human. It's a scholar that asks the right question. So if I want to find something about diplomacy, of course I go to the letters of the ambassadors. That's all diplomacy. Ambassadors are diplomats, right? I read thousands and thousands of letters, and I basically discover what I need to discover, right? But then you can objectify, again, the gift, the diplomatic gift is a means of diplomacy, is a way to objectify diplomacy. The question of gender studies was much more complex. I mean, if I were to tag under the category of gender studies everything that deals with women, then I have thousands and thousands of documents, I mean, am I boiling down something? Am I restricting and filtering my research to a very precise thing? No, not really. I mean, you can do it. I mean, I can actually tell the machine, give me all the documents, that deal with women. You can do that. It's not in the category section, it's in a different section, but it doesn't solve anything. I mean, I still have hundreds and hundreds of documents with women. Yes, and how do I, so that was the, then there are much more, they're kind of categories which are a lot more definable. Violence, for instance, I mean, it's, there's been, the history of violence or the history of emotions, these are relatively new disciplines, right? In many ways. Violence, no, but history of emotions for sure. How do I qualify that, and and what are the benchmarks? What are the signs? What are the sort of the parameters for such a liquid, a magmatic kind of category? So to go back to your question, the way we made it dynamic is by empowering the scholar, the user, to create a meta category, as I mentioned before, the library of Cosimo I, right? Which are much more specific, also much more personal, much more subjective, and they allow us to partially solve the problem. But in a sense, that problem cannot be solved in many ways. I mean, I cannot, I would like to add new things, and I had thought about adding new things, but it's not that easy, A, because the structure is existing already, and B, because the categories that are emerging are a lot more protean. They're much more, they have a much more undefined shape, and I don't want to risk, adding things to a category that doesn't really belong there. See what I mean? That would in a sense would slow down the search process, the research process. And that's so the dynamic aspect, the archives are always changing. The very fact of the platform today tells you that the archive is subject to a new set of rules, to a new set of parameters. These parameters are always changing, just as we had so many different kinds of platforms growing one from the other, right? There will probably be a new platform in 4 or 5 years, which will, in a sense, accept and contemplate the dynamic aspect in ways which are much more contemporary to the needs of a scholar. Because after all, we try to give information, and and we have the problem of big data, right? I don't resolve it by making big small. I resolve it by making big slow, which is different.
I have here 2 comments in the chat. The first is from Stefan Alikovsky-Smith. Impressive collective enterprise with all its spin-off activities. A mundane question: is it possible to watch the presentation by Alison Brown on Piero for the map, which took place yesterday? Do you upload your talks to someone YouTube channel? Un saluto, Stephen. This talk will be uploaded to the YouTube channel of CHAM and our project.
If you go on our website, there's all the information on how to watch Alison Brown. I watched only half of it because I had to go last night. But I mean, you can watch it. There's a way of go to our website. There's something called Friends of Map. Click there, and you have all the data, how to access to that stuff.
And João Figueiredo Regues, grazie mille, remarkable presentation. What an extraordinary and challenging archive. Indeed. I have another question, because you mentioned this material about the Jewish ghetto. I didn't understand it's a kind of census of population of the Jewish ghetto in some, okay?
Yeah, that's a separate thing. This is something we're working on, which is because we're working from a different perspective. I mean, well, I think we have already entered digitally, not in terms of metadata, all the images of the list of people, in the list of Jews living in the ghetto. But I want to approach this project from a different perspective. That is, the platform allows you some genealogical, rendition. There is, every profile of every biographical profile has space for, mother and father, siblings, and all that stuff. But it only allows you for 1 or 2 generations. Otherwise you have to go back and back and back. Son begat, but just like the Old Testament, and again, it becomes very. It's not really user friendly. So we're working on a genealogical project with the Center of Jewish History in New York. Because they work a lot on genealogies. So and they're very interested in genealogy. But they're working on genealogies for Ashkenazi Jews from Poland in the 19th century. We're dealing with a completely different thing. Also, the kind of data that is a list of Jews living one by name of everyone, and also not just a list of Jews, also their financial documentation. It's a very precious kind of corpus of documents that I haven't seen around that much in other European Jewish centers, or other sort of, whether they're neighborhoods or ghettos, whatever you want to call them, in the early modern period, So it's a census, which is we need to think about it, because I want to make it more useful. And the platform MIA allows you for some genealogical study, but not a vaster genealogy, especially when you have, various strands of generations mixing again. Remember, we're talking about a very limited number of people. That is implemented, that is increased by immigration. So if you think about it, the Jews in the 1540s were mostly, Florentine Jews. Medici said, all the Jews of Tuscany come to Florence, right? And they're mostly Italian, Idalchim, sort of Florentine Jews, Italian Jews. Then with the tsunami of Sephardic Jews coming mostly from Northern Europe via, from Spain, but via Northern Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula via Northern Europe, then you have this kind of mix of things. And the system, MIA, doesn't allow for an intelligent kind of rendition for search entries for that. And that's what we're thinking now. That's our next project, because of the great number of, because also we have all the names, their financial records, and also where they lived, and bear in mind that there's a difficulty working with the Jews in Florence, because the rich Jews didn't live in the ghetto. They rented a space. They had to rent a space. They couldn't own anything. So they rented a space in the ghetto. They had an apartment, but the rich ones were able to live outside the ghetto, right? In fact, the enlargement of the ghetto was a way that Cosimo III, who was a very bigoted sort of Grand Duke, wanted to bring them back inside the ghetto, right? But the ones who can afford lived outside. Now, the question is, how can they own something if Jews couldn't own anything? They own things by having partnerships, financial partnerships with Christians. And it was a business home, not a private home. So they would have it was an office, like an office space in the house, so to speak, So that's how they were able to, come to terms with this. So it's very hard to map out and quantify, Jews in Florence, even though we have so much information. And that's what we're working on right now, aside from the exhibitions, which are a much more aesthetic thing.
Okay, I don't know if someone can want to put another question, a final question. Maybe not. So I only will have that everyone can access to this information. It's free. You have to fill a form, yes, in the platform, and then you have access to BIA and the BIA.
Yeah. So, for instance, I will just give you one small project that we're working on right now. Which is this: one of Cosimo I, antique dealer, right? His name was Jacobilio Ebreo, Jacob. Jacobilio means small Jacob in Italian. We didn't know his last name because everything is Jacobilio Ebreo, never. We discovered that his name is Jacob de Nunes, So he was, and this is how complex, that's why when you go back to digitization or the digital aspect, he was a Sephardic Jew of Iberian, obviously, and probably on the Western Iberia background, who had moved to Flanders, came to Florence, and was a merchant that went from, Florence, Venice, and Constantinople. And every time he went to a city, he changed his name. How do you map that out? That's why we need to think about, of a liquid population, of a liquid nation, as Jews are, especially Jews, that are constantly on the move, and not because of reasons other than Florence was a hub, right? So we have one spot to locate, who they are, what they do, but then they are itinerant all the time, and it's very hard to research. So this Jacobilio Ebreo, which is the topic of and he has published about this, our director of the Jewish Center, which is Pier Gabriele Mancuso, he published this, and to find his last name took him 3 years, and he thought he was dealing with 3 people, instead it was one person changing name all the time. So, but he was close to Cosimo, the Duke. Cosimo called him amico, right? So there's a lot of things that one has to, because one of our major projects is the Jewish program. Let's say it's with the women artists is the one that we care about the most, simply because the sheer amount of information and the amount of information that when we usually give lectures in New York, right? And we were giving a lecture series, in a couple of weeks at this place called the Stryker Center, which is Temple Emmanuel, which was on Fifth Avenue. And when we speak to Gabriele and I would give these lectures, we would speak really in front of, the place can hold 1,500 people. So it's always filled because it's rated. But when we talk about, Jews in Florence, for American, Ashkenazi Jew, there is, the Roman Empire, a big gap, and then 18th century, late 18th century, and there's nothing in the middle, precisely because the majority is Ashkenazi, and the Sephardic are very small. So when we fill in that gap, right? There were Jews in Florence. I mean, they know there were Jews in Rome, but they're the Roman Jews. They've been there forever. I mean, I'm Roman, and they're more Roman than I am because they've been there before, us Romans, right? But there's this big gap, and most of the time we try to tell people there is a history, and a history in the Medici realm is going back to what Kevin said, a dynamic history. It's a history which is of incredible interpenetration and incredible cohabitation with rules changing all the time, with bans and restrictions, but it's an incredible, how do you quantify that digitally? How do you explain that? We can't. What we can do is provide you with the primary sources for the scholars to do it. That's all we can do.
Thank you. Thank you, Alessio. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. And I just will remember that this conversation, this WSD talk will be available in our website soon. So thank you. We will have another WSD talk in May or June, I don't know, and I will let you know in our networks and in our social media and in our website. So thank you a lot and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Ciao, ciao. Ciao. Ciao, ciao.